He was the king of the night, rich, feared, untouchable. But one bullet at the harbor shattered everything: his empire, his best friend's loyalty, and his only chance to escape. Now he sits in a prison cell, no crown, no crew, just the dark truth of how it all went wrong. The city never really slept, it only changed masks. In daylight, it pretended to be respectable, all glass offices and hurried footsteps. But at night, it showed its true face in neon. Under those restless lights, Rico Valente sat in the high booth of his own club and watched the streets breathe. The music below him pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and relentless, and every beat meant money flowing into his world. Men in suits slipped through the doors with nervous eyes. Women in shimmering dresses laughed too loudly, and somewhere in the crowd, deals were being made under the cover of bass and smoke. Rico had built this life from the cracked sidewalks up. As a boy, he had learned the language of the streets faster than any school lesson. He remembered long evenings standing on corners, the taste of cheap cigarettes he was too young to smoke, the way older men sized him up and saw something sharp and useful. He ran packages before he understood what was inside them, took punches before he understood why they were thrown, and by the time most kids were worrying about exams, he was already learning how to balance fear and respect in every handshake. The Neon Tigers did not exist when he started. There were only scattered crews, small-time operators scrambling for territory. Rico watched them fight and bleed, and he made a quiet promise that he would not die faceless in some forgotten alley. He studied every move of the older bosses, learned who they trusted, and why the trust eventually killed them. When the opportunity came, when two rival outfits tore each other apart in a senseless war, he moved in with a speed that surprised even his own allies. He offered stability where others offered chaos, protection where others sold fear. The Neon Tigers rose from that vacuum, a new symbol painted in bright colors on the old brick walls. Years later, Rico sat above Club Neon and everything seemed to belong to him. The bartenders knew his signals without words. The bouncers watched every doorway with loyalty sharpened by the knowledge that he had pulled some of them out of the gutter. The dealers in the back rooms paid their percentage, with only a hint of resentment. Even the police drove past the club with careful eyes, aware that invisible lines had been drawn, and that crossing them came with a cost. Yet the view from the top did not feel like he had imagined in his childhood. The suits were finer, the cash heavier, the cars faster, but the air was thinner up here. Every success gave birth to more threats. Each rival removed today created a rival's cousin who would appear tomorrow, hungry and reckless. His phone never stopped buzzing. Lawyers with bad news, accountants hinting at investigations, lieutenants whispering about disrespect on distant corners. Every message demanded a decision, and every decision created another thin crack in the foundation of his empire. On certain nights, when the music faded just enough and the smoke parted in the lights, Rico would catch his own reflection in the dark glass of the booth. He saw the sharp lines of his jaw, the faint scars, the precise cut of his suit. He also saw the exhaustion in his own eyes, that dull layer that no amount of wealth could polish away. He thought about the men he had watched fall over the years, both enemies and allies, and how none of them truly saw the end coming. There was always one more score, one more territory, one more rival to crush. They died convinced that they still controlled their fate, even as the city made other plans. Quietly, without sharing it with anyone, Rico began to think about what it would mean to walk away. The idea felt almost ridiculous the first time it appeared, like a joke told at the wrong table. The streets did not forget their kings easily. They chewed them up or buried them with ornate funerals. Leaving alive required a different kind of power, one he was not sure he possessed. Still, the thought returned on sleepless mornings when the sky outside his penthouse barely started to lighten, and his body felt heavier than his years. He imagined businesses that did not require guns in the back office. restaurants with his name only on the paperwork, not whispered in fear. Maybe another city, somewhere with a shoreline, where he could walk the streets without a convoy of cars trailing him. The fantasy was simple, almost naive, but it carried a warmth that none of his current luxuries managed to provide. There were obstacles, of course, layers of them. Men who depended on him for their own survival, enemies who would see his departure as weakness, law enforcement waiting for any sign that his grip might be slipping. And beneath all that, the city itself, a living thing that had grown used to his presence, that had shaped itself around the weight of his name. Stepping away would not be like closing a door. It would be like trying to redraw the skyline with bare hands. Still, the notion threaded itself through his days. During meetings in dim back rooms, while others argued over percentages and routes, Rico's mind would drift to bank accounts far from the city, to investments that could grow quietly without attracting the wrong kind of attention. When he watched his younger men boast and posture, he recognized in them the same hunger that had once driven him, and felt an unfamiliar distance from it. He saw their eagerness as something fragile, dangerous in its blindness. One evening, as the club swelled with life again, Rico adjusted his cufflinks and looked over the crowd with a colder eye. He counted not just profits, but possible exits. He noted which men might follow him into a quieter future, and which would need to be appeased or avoided. The machinery of the neon tigers kept turning, but somewhere inside him, a new mechanism began to move, slow and careful. It was not a plan yet, only a direction, away from the neon lights that had made him and toward some unknown horizon that might yet save him from the fate that waited for men in his position. The night Lena Cruz entered Club Neon, the atmosphere did not change immediately. The music still pulsed, drinks still clinked, and the regulars still leaned across tables with secrets on their tongues. She slipped in like any other hopeful performer, carrying a worn bag with her stage shoes and sheet music that she did not actually need. The hostess gave her a quick once-over, then pointed her toward the back hallway that led to the manager's office and the small stage entrance. Lena's reflection in the mirror near the dressing room showed a woman carefully constructed for this mission. Her dress was elegant but not extravagant, the color chosen to catch the club's lighting just enough to be memorable. Her hair was done in a style that framed her face softly, making her eyes appear larger and more open, the sort of eyes people instinctively trusted. Beneath the foundation and lipstick, there were thin lines of tension around her mouth that she had learned to hide. She had trained for months before walking into this building. Not as a singer. Those skills had been with her for years, nurtured in small bars and community theaters long before the police academy. The preparation had focused on something else: how to be invisible while standing under a spotlight, how to listen more than she spoke, how to let people underestimate her. Her file at the station described her as adaptable, self-controlled, capable of holding a role without letting it hold her. Whether the paper truly captured the weight of that requirement was another question. To the outside world, Lena Cruz was a singer looking for steady work in a city that offered talent no guarantees. To the task force quietly charting the movements of the Neon Tigers, she was their best chance at getting close to the man they had chased for years. Rico Valente had slipped through raids and investigations with a mixture of discipline and luck. Informants grew scarce as his power solidified. The officers in their plain offices watched the same footage countless times, the same grainy images of his convoy, the same reports of businesses tied to unknown shell companies. They needed someone inside his daily life, not a distant observer or a nervous street-level contact. Lena understood the file on Rico as much as any of them. She had memorized the bullet points: early hustler, rapid rise, reputation for controlled violence rather than spectacle, preference for loyalty over chaos. Yet the pages could not tell her how he would act as a man looking down at his domain each night, or what kind of gaze she would meet when she finally stepped onto his stage. The unknown variable lay not in the thick binder of evidence, but in whatever remained human beneath his carefully crafted legend. Her first performance at the club was scheduled as a test slot, a short set between the regular acts. The crowd did not pay much attention when she walked onto the stage in the wash of colored lights. They had seen singers come and go, some too nervous to hit their notes, others too eager to impress. The band gave her a brief nod. She signaled the tempo with a small gesture, then let the music carry her. When she sang, the noise of the club shifted in subtle ways. Conversations lowered by a fraction, as if people wanted to keep talking but could not help glancing toward the stage. Her voice did not try to dominate the room. Instead, it wrapped itself around the existing ambience, threading through the bass and percussion like a river beneath city streets. She chose songs that told stories without demanding attention, yet with enough emotion to leave a faint mark on anyone who listened. Up in the booth, Rico noticed the shift before he fully saw her. Years of living in rooms like this had sharpened his instincts for changes in energy. He turned toward the stage and observed the singer with the same measuring gaze he used on new dealers or potential rivals. There was nothing flashy in her performance, no aggressive charm. There was a steadiness instead, a control over her own presence that felt out of place among the desperate striving of most entertainers he had seen. Lena, for her part, did not scan the upper booths directly. She knew from the floor plans where his preferred seat was, and she felt the weight of that unseen scrutiny like a slight warmth on the side of her face. She did not need to see his expression to know that the crucial first impression was being formed in those moments. Her training reminded her to keep her breathing even, to let the persona of the singer wrap itself around her like a protective layer. The undercover officer remained just behind her eyes, counting exits, noting faces near the stage, storing details of who whispered to whom. When her set ended, the applause was polite and real enough. The manager made a show of assessing her performance before offering her additional nights, but Lena sensed the influence of a decision made higher up. The path toward Rico's inner circle never appeared as a straight line. It revealed itself in small concessions, in the way staff members began greeting her by name faster than they did with other newcomers, in invitations to linger in the staff lounge where certain conversations flowed more freely. Days turned into weeks, and Lena's presence in the club became part of its rhythm. She learned to navigate the backstage politics, to offer casual compliments where they mattered, to deflect too personal questions with self-deprecating humor instead of suspicion. Each night brought scraps of information back to the task force, names of mid-level operators, hints of financial arrangements, patterns in the comings and goings of people tied to the Neon Tigers. Eventually, the invisible line between public space and Rico's private world shifted. An invitation arrived indirectly, through the manager, for her to join a small gathering in the VIP section after closing. It was framed as a celebration of the club's recent success, nothing more. The officers monitoring her wire understood it differently. The beginning of true proximity, the moment when she would step from observing his world to being observed inside it. Lena walked up the stairs toward the booth with calm steps. Her heartbeat kept its own rhythm beneath the fading music. She knew that after this night, her role would grow heavier. She would be judged not only on her ability to sing, but on her capacity to become someone Rico might trust in a world where trust was a currency more valuable than money. Somewhere deep under the layers of training and duty, a quieter question whispered how much of herself she would have to trade away to complete this mission, and whether there would be anything left to reclaim once the lights of Club Neon finally went dark. The bond between Rico and Dante had been forged long before the Neon Tigers had a name. As teenagers, they had shared doorways for shelter and split cheap meals, both of them watching the older men with equal parts envy and defiance. Dante had always moved one step behind Rico, not out of weakness, but out of choice. He liked the view from the shoulder of the one in front, where he could see both the path and the dangers without being the first to face them. When Rico began to rise through the ranks, Dante's presence beside him became an unspoken constant. In the early years of the Neon Tigers, Dante proved himself in ways that earned him a permanent place at Rico's side. He handled the Messier tasks without complaint, shielded his friend from impulsive younger men, and navigated street disputes with a mix of intimidation and grudging charisma. When they took their first real territory, carving it away from a weakened rival, Dante stood beside Rico in the aftermath, both of them breathing hard in the smoky darkness and understanding that their lives had just crossed a line they could never uncross. Time cemented their arrangement. Rico became the face, the strategist, the one who met with high-level partners and made decisions with common sense rather than adrenaline. Dante became the right hand, the enforcer, the one who translated Rico's orders into action. It was a dynamic that worked because each man knew his role and accepted it. Their disagreements never reached public ears. Their loyalty to each other became part of the Neon Tigers mythology, a warning to anyone thinking about exploitation or betrayal. The arrival of Lena introduced a new variable into this old equation. At first, Dante barely noticed her beyond the surface. He had seen singers come and go, and he assumed she would drift away after a few months in search of better opportunities or safer stages. The fact that Rico's gaze lingered a little longer on her performances seemed trivial. Every boss in every club eventually fixed on some performer. It rarely affected the deeper operations. Gradually, however, Dante observed subtle shifts. Rico's visits to the club became more regular, not because of a pressing business need but because he wanted to be present on certain nights. Conversations he once had in the back office now took place at a table closer to the stage. When Lena finished her sets, she would be invited to join them briefly, and the atmosphere around the table softened in intangible ways. Dante noticed how Rico asked the singer questions about music, about city neighborhoods, about trivial things that had nothing to do with shipments or turf. He heard his friend laugh in a tone that had become rare in recent years. It should have reassured him, proof that Rico still possessed a human side beneath the calculations. Instead, a seed of unease took root. Any distraction, however harmless it appeared, represented vulnerability. The unease deepened when business took on a sharper edge. A rival group known as the Iron Serpents began pushing at the edges of Neon Tiger territory, testing boundaries with bold graffiti, sudden attacks on low-level associates, and whispers in the bars. Rico handled it at first with restraint, preferring to avoid open war. Dante agreed in principle, but he also felt the impatience of the younger soldiers, who saw hesitation as weakness. Conversations between Rico and Dante shifted in tone during those weeks. Seated in back rooms with maps spread across tables, they reviewed reports and arguments. Dante advocated decisive strikes, targeted attacks that would send a clear message. Rico responded with measured alternatives, focusing on economic pressure and diplomatic channels with mutually connected partners. Each believed his approach served the organization's long-term survival, yet beneath their tactical disagreement, something more personal stirred. Dante began to sense that Rico's thoughts were not entirely on the game before them. There were moments when his friend's gaze drifted, when his attention snapped back with a small delay, as if he had been listening to some internal voice. Dante knew Rico well enough to understand that he was contemplating more than territorial lines. He guessed, with growing certainty, that the idea of leaving this life had moved from fantasy to tentative plan. The realization created a fracture inside Dante. On one side was his loyalty, built over years of shared hardship and mutual support. On the other side was the stark question of his own future. If Rico stepped away, where would that leave the man who had built his identity as the right hand? The Neon Tigers were not a corporate firm where positions could be smoothly transferred. A departing king left behind a battlefield, not a vacancy notice. Meanwhile, Lena's role in Rico's intimacies expanded in ways Dante observed with increasing tension. She was invited into discussions that Dante believed should have remained between old allies. Her opinions, offered lightly and without apparent agenda, were nonetheless considered. Rico shared fragments of his doubts with her, small comments about being tired of constant conflict, about dreams of quieter ventures. Dante overheard some of these moments from a distance, catching only tone, not exact words, but tone was enough. The turning point came with the proposal of a large-scale deal at the harbor. It promised to consolidate resources, secure new routes, and potentially provide the financial foundation for Rico's exit from the underworld. The scheme was ambitious, risky, and layered with the kind of complexity that left no room for missteps. Rico treated it as both a final gamble and an escape hatch. He needed people he trusted completely to know the details. He chose to share the full plan with only two individuals: Dante, whose operational expertise would ensure smooth execution, and Lena, whose presence in his private life had grown into a quiet anchor. Rico framed the inclusion of each as a gesture of trust, an acknowledgement of their importance in the two worlds he straddled. For Dante, the knowledge landed like a heavy stone. On the surface, it reaffirmed his status as confidant and executor. Beneath the surface, it confirmed his fear that Rico's vision did not include him in whatever life lay beyond the harbor. He saw clearly how the deal could fund a disappearance, how new, legitimate ventures could be set up under different names in distant places. The picture that formed in his mind placed Lena at Rico's side in those new settings, a companion suited to the softer life he sought. Dante, with his history and reputation, saw no place for himself in that image. Jealousy alone might not have been enough to turn him, but combined with fear and a sense of erasure, it became combustible. He began to imagine scenarios where Rico's departure led to the disintegration of the Neon Tigers, leaving their enemies to carve up what remained. He compared the nightmare to an alternative in which he stepped forward, removed the uncertain element, and positioned himself as the new center of power. The Iron Serpents, sensing tension, made subtle overtures through intermediaries, hinting at alliances and shared gains if a transition were to occur. Inside Dante, loyalty and ambition wrestled in a silent, brutal contest. He recalled nights when Rico had stood between him and a bullet, times when they had covered each other's backs in alleyways where the only law was survival. He also saw the current reality: a boss whose mind was half in another life, whose confidences were drifting toward a woman who had not earned them through blood and years. In that distorted balance, betrayal began to look less like treason and more like self-preservation. When he finally reached out to the Iron Serpents with concrete information about the harbor deal, his hand did not tremble. He presented it as a business proposition, a chance to remove a shared obstacle and redistribute power. He convinced himself that the city needed a leader who would not abandon it for some imagined peace. Somewhere deep within, a different voice whispered that he was crossing a line from which there would be no return, but he buried it beneath the familiar instinct that had guided him all his life: do what is necessary to survive, even if survival means tearing apart the only brother he had ever known. On the night of the harbor deal, the city's lights seemed to fade more quickly than usual, as if whatever was about to happen required a darker backdrop. The air carried the scent of salt and oil, a harsh blend rising from the water, and the silent hulks of cargo containers lined along the docks. The harbor had seen countless legitimate transactions over the years, ships arriving and departing with goods that kept the city functioning. Tonight, it would witness a different kind of commerce, one measured not in legal manifests, but in whispered promises and unspoken threats. Rico arrived with a small, carefully chosen group of men. The convoy of vehicles approached without ostentation, headlights dimmed as they rolled down the access road and spread out in designated positions. Every movement had been rehearsed in his mind, each man assigned both a primary role and a backup. The stakes were too high for improvisation. If the deal went as planned, it would consolidate control over lucrative routes and provide enough financial cushion to make his dream of departure viable. If it went wrong, the fallout would be severe. Dante rode in the vehicle nearest to Rico's, his expression neutral, his mind sharply focused. He had ensured that the outward signs of preparation met Rico's high standards. The men were experienced, the weapons clean and ready, the perimeter surveyed. Underneath this careful orchestration lay the invisible layer of his own arrangements, coded signals sent to the iron serpents, timing coordinated so their forces could move in at the most vulnerable moment. He had not shared the specifics of his betrayal with anyone. In operations of this nature, fewer witnesses meant fewer loose ends. Lena's presence at the harbor was less conspicuous. Officially, her role in the deal was non-existent. Unofficially, she had become one of the few people Rico truly trusted, and he wanted her close, perhaps as a witness to the turning point he envisioned for his life. She arrived separately, blending with the shadows and machinery, having also informed her handlers and law enforcement of the time and place. The task force had spent days readying their own response, wrestling with the challenge of intervening in a way that might capture multiple major targets without igniting a full-scale battlefield. As the parties gathered near the designated loading area, a tense calm settled over the harbor. The visiting partners, representatives of an international network whose identities were cloaked behind expensive coats and careful smiles, inspected the arrangements with professional detachment. Crates were opened to reveal samples of goods that would not appear on any legitimate inventory. Briefcases were displayed with neatly stacked bundles, the tangible form of debts and loyalties. Rico moved among these elements with the composed assurance of a man accustomed to high-risk negotiations. He checked the seals, nodded at the figures presented, and exchanged the kind of eye contact that meant more than any signatures could. His mind weighed not only the immediate transaction, but also the future implications. This deal would either cement his reputation as a mastermind or mark the moment his empire began to fracture. The awareness of that edge sharpened his senses. Lena positioned herself at a slight distance, close enough for Rico to feel her presence, far enough to appear peripheral. To the untrained observer, she might have seemed like a curious companion dragged along for moral support or as a token of celebration. In reality, her thoughts raced with calculations of angles, cover points, and the likely positions of the police units moving into place. Her orders had been clear: gather as much evidence as possible, ensure a signal was given at the right time, and, if feasible, help bring Rico in alive for questioning. The first sign that the night was shifting came in sound, not sight. The distant echo of tires on asphalt, slightly out of rhythm with the expected traffic, carried faintly over the water. Rico's eyes narrowed. He had planned for the possibility of interference, both from law enforcement and from rivals, but the timing felt off. His men exchanged glances, hands unconsciously drifting closer to their weapons. Before any commands could be issued, the world fractured. The harsh screech of armored vehicles cut through the night as they surged from concealed positions, lights bursting on in blinding beams. At almost the same time, figures emerged from behind stacks of containers on the opposite side, their movements fluid and aggressive. The iron serpents had arrived, their insignia visible in flashes, as they spread out in an attacking formation. The police and the rival gang had converged almost in unison, creating a chaotic triangle with the neon tigers at its unstable center. Gunfire erupted, shattering the fragile order of the deal. The first shots were almost indistinguishable from one another, making it impossible to determine who had fired. Men dug behind crates, vehicles, and whatever cover they could find. The sharp cracks of pistols and the deeper roars of automatic weapons mingled with the screams of wounded and the shouted commands of law enforcement. Floodlights flicked on and off as bullets struck electrical boxes, plunging sections of the dock into stuttering darkness. Rico reacted with a mixture of instinct and experience. He shoved a nearby associate toward the ground, using a container as a shield while he assessed the direction of the heaviest fire. His mind ran through possibilities. A coincidence of timing, a leak in security, or something more deliberate. He scanned the positions of his own men, noting those who were returning fire in disciplined bursts, and those who were panicking. Somewhere in the smoke and glare, he caught sight of Lena, crouched behind a metal barrier, her posture too controlled to belong to someone unaccustomed to such chaos. The realization that law enforcement was involved struck with a sharper impact than any bullet. Vehicles marked with the city's insignia were now clearly visible, officers advancing in tactical gear, their shouts of warning barely audible over the gunfire. This was no simple raid. It was a coordinated operation, timed to intersect precisely with the deal. Only a handful of people had been privy to the exact details of the meeting. Rico felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Dante moved through the firefight with a focus honed by countless street skirmishes. He directed men to new positions, returned fire on the advancing iron serpents, and kept an eye on Rico's location. He had anticipated violence, but even he was surprised by the intensity of the clash between the rival gang and the police. The risk he had taken by orchestrating this convergence was becoming brutally apparent. If he miscalculated, there would be no winners, only bodies left for the tides to claim. As the minutes stretched and the dock transformed into a battleground, the internal tensions came to a head. Rico and Dante found themselves momentarily in the same pocket of cover, bullets slicing the air above them. In the quick exchange of glances, years of shared history passed unspoken. Rico saw something in Dante's eyes he had never expected to find there, a guardedness that hinted at deeper secrets. Simultaneously, Dante saw in Rico the stubborn determination of a man who still believed he could control the outcome, even as forces beyond his command converged. The shootout reached a climactic point when one of the cargo containers, struck repeatedly, began to tip and fall, crashing onto the dock with a deafening roar. The impact threw several men off their feet, and sent up a cloud of dust and debris. In that moment of disorientation, Dante saw what he believed was his last chance to shape events in his favor. If Rico did not leave this harbor alive, the path to leadership would be open, and the Iron Serpents would have every reason to honor their covert agreement. He shifted his aim subtly, choosing a position from which his shot could be mistaken for stray fire. Rico, rising to direct a group of his men toward a safer route, exposed himself for an instant. A burst of bullets tore through the space, some from rival guns, some from Dante's weapon. Rico felt the impact in his shoulder, a sudden searing pain that sent him sprawling behind a crate. Blood soaked through his suit, warm and insistent, reminding him that for all his planning, he was still flesh subject to the laws of violence. Lena saw him fall and moved toward him without hesitation, instincts and training merging into a single purpose. She knew what her handlers might prefer, what would simplify their case and narrative, but she could not ignore the fact that Rico had trusted her in ways that complicated the neat boundaries of right and wrong. As she reached him and dragged him farther into cover, the chaos of the harbor continued to rage, each passing second shredding the old structure of the Neon Tigers and reshaping the lives of everyone caught within its blast radius. In the days following the harbor battle, the city murmured with rumors. Official statements spoke of a successful joint operation, of major arrests, and the disruption of organized crime networks. The news showed footage of seized weapons, impounded vehicles, and solemn-faced officers standing behind microphones. Names were mentioned carefully, charges outlined, and promises made that the streets would be safer now. The reality beneath those announcements was more complicated, knotted with deals struck in interrogation rooms and unspoken compromises between agencies and informants. Rico Valente woke in a hospital ward under heavy guard, his body a map of pain that reminded him with every breath of the line he had nearly crossed into death. The bullet wounds had been serious but not immediately fatal, thanks in part to the speed with which Lena had reached him. Medical staff moved around him with professional detachment, inserting tubes, checking monitors, noting his vitals. They addressed him by a surname shorn of titles, a patient rather than a kingpin. That simple shift in how strangers treated him marked the first real sign that his world had changed. Even before he could fully process his surroundings, the questions began. Officers and prosecutors took turns approaching his bedside, some with hard eyes, others with expressions that hinted at negotiation. They spoke of charges carrying decades of prison time, of evidence recovered from the harbor, and from subsequent raids on Neon Tiger properties. They laid out the weight of the law like bricks stacked around him, a structure closing in from all sides. In between these visits, his mind wandered back through scenes of his life, street corners, club lights, faces of men who had followed him into battles, some never to return. Lena's role in those days was carefully controlled by her superiors. She had provided a mountain of information during her undercover work. Her testimony would be crucial in securing convictions against multiple figures in the underworld. There were commendations waiting in sealed envelopes, pending the conclusion of trials. Yet beneath the formal ceremonies to come lay a more personal strand of responsibility. She had been the pivot point at the harbor, the one who both enabled law enforcement to strike and chose, in a critical moment, to pull Rico away from the spray of bullets instead of leaving him to his fate. When she was finally allowed to see him, their meeting took place in a sterile room, with glass and metal separating them, guards hovering in the background. There were no romantic gestures or cinematic declarations, only a heavy silence filled with the weight of everything unspoken. Lena knew that speaking of remorse or gratitude would complicate the narrative she needed to present in court. Rico understood that acknowledging any sense of betrayal or forgiveness out loud would weaken the strategic posture he still had to maintain. In that quiet, each processed the strange kind of freedom that had emerged from the wreckage. Lena had completed her assignment, but the line between her role and her real self had blurred in ways training manuals never fully addressed. She had lived inside the world of the Neon Tigers for long enough that its rhythms had become familiar. Letting go of that environment, even a toxic one, felt like stepping off a moving train. Rico, meanwhile, found himself unmoored from the routines that had structured his life for decades. No more impromptu meetings at the club, no more late-night strategy sessions, no more silent drives through streets that had once been in his domain. The decision that reshaped the aftermath came not from a single dramatic epiphany, but from a slow convergence of pressures and reflections. Prosecutors offered Rico a choice. He could stonewall, cling to a code of silence that had governed the underworld for generations, and face a sentence that would likely ensure he died behind bars. Or he could cooperate, providing details about the inner workings of the Neon Tigers and the Iron Serpents, exposing financial networks and corrupt officials, and in return receive some measure of leniency. The law still had to be seen to act firmly, but judges and agencies understood the value of dismantling structures rather than merely decapitating them. For a man like Rico, whose entire identity had been built on loyalty and control, the idea of cooperating with authorities might once have been unthinkable. Yet the harbor had stripped away illusions. He had seen his organization torn apart by forces both external and internal. He had felt the betrayal of a man he had once considered a brother. He had recognized, in the moment before he fell, that the life he had clung to was no longer sustainable on its own terms. The dream of walking away clean had died in that hail of gunfire. In its place stood a more modest, perhaps more honest ambition, to ensure that if he had to fall, he would not drag countless others into the same abyss. He agreed to talk. The process was exhaustive. Days blurred into weeks as he sat in interview rooms, recounting names, dates, operations, and alliances. Charts grew longer on whiteboards. Warrants were issued based on his information. Some of his former associates vanished ahead of arrests, warned by unknown leaks in the system, but many did not. The Neon Tigers, once a sleek, fearsome presence in the city's underworld, fractured into scattered remnants. The Iron Serpents, already weakened by their heavy losses at the harbor, found themselves targeted in subsequent operations, their remaining leadership picked off in raids or cornered by rival groups exploiting their vulnerability. Rico took no pleasure in these outcomes, but neither did he mourn the collapse of structures he had once worked tirelessly to build. He saw them now as inevitable extensions of choices made years earlier, choices that had led him to believe that power could be held indefinitely by force and cunning. The city would not become innocent overnight. No place ever did, but for a time, at least, the specific machinery he had helped construct would stop grinding up lives. Eventually, the legal machinery reached its own conclusions. Rico stood in a courtroom, thinner than he had been in his club days, his suit less tailored, his face bearing the subtle marks of someone who had survived both physical and psychological battles. The judge read out the charges and the agreed-upon terms. He received a prison sentence significant enough to reflect his crimes, but reduced in recognition of his cooperation. There were murmurs in the gallery, from victims' families, from journalists, from those who still romanticized or demonized his name. Prison life bore little resemblance to the opulent spaces he had once occupied. The days were structured by routines he did not set, governed by rules he had not written. He shared spaces with men whose crimes ranged from petty to appalling, some of whom recognized him and eyed him with a mixture of awe and resentment. Over time, the novelty faded. He became another inmate standing in line for meals, another figure on the yard walking slow circles under the watchful gaze of guards. In that constrained environment, Rico found a different kind of reflection. Without constant emergencies to address, without underlings vying for attention, he was left alone with his own thoughts. He revisited moments from his past, not as triumphs or failures, but as steps on a path that had always been narrower than he realized. He thought of the boys they had once been, he and Dante, and how quickly survival instincts could warp into justifications for cruelty. He thought of Lena, of the peculiar collision of their lives, and wondered whether she ever walked past Club Neon now, and if so, what she felt when she saw its sign. Outside the prison walls, the city continued its endless cycle of reinvention. New clubs opened, new gangs rose, and new schemes unfolded in alleys and boardrooms. Yet the particular era of the Neon Tigers faded into memory, a story told with varying degrees of accuracy depending on who did the telling. Some painted Rico as a cold villain, others as a tragic figure seeking redemption. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, in the ordinary human contradictions that never fit neatly into headlines. On certain afternoons, when the light slanted through the barred windows in a way that softened the harsh angles of the cells, Rico allowed himself to imagine an alternate life he had once chased. A cafe with outdoor seating in another country, a business that required nothing more violent than stubborn perseverance, anonymity in a crowd where no one knew his history. He knew now that he would never fully inhabit that fantasy. Yet, paradoxically, the confinement of prison granted him a sliver of what he had always wanted, a life no longer defined by constant danger, no longer driven by the need to dominate every room he entered. He was no longer a king, no longer the man whose name made entire neighborhoods hold their breath. He was, instead, a man living with the consequences of his choices, contributing in his own limited way to the dismantling of the structures he had once championed. In that quiet, stripped-down existence, he found a strange, unexpected freedom, Not the freedom of movement or wealth, but the freedom of finally stepping out of the role the streets had written for him and seeing, however belatedly, the human being that remained underneath.